in the middle of a unit that deals with some of the practices, the hanhagot of people in this mystical circle in Tzfat that we've been discussing from the 16th century. Now, one of the leading teachers of this circle was a very prolific author by the name of Moshe Cordovero. And Cordovero's influence was considerable, and you know, scholars trace many of the Hasidic teachings to a lot of his writings. So we're going to take a look at some of the things that he encouraged his students to follow. So, and we'll just, we'll read one paragraph at a time, and I'll have comments on some of them. But as we go along, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions or to comment. So, a person should not turn his heart away from meditating upon words of Torah and holiness, so that his heart will not be empty and void of reflection upon the commandments, and in order that his heart may become a dwelling place for the Shekhinah. Now, this idea of the heart being a dwelling place for the Shekhinah, that, the mystic's heart is where God really lives. That's something that actually came into Judaism from Islam, from the Sufi mystics, right? Earlier Kabbalists brought this idea along. It goes well with the notion of devekut, of cleaving to God. If your heart is connected to God at all times, that there's never a moment that you're awake that that God is not present in your thoughts. As we said earlier, when we talked about devekut last year, the idea is that it's just like when you're driving a car, you can be doing all sorts of other things, but your main attention is on the road ahead, because that's what you got to do, right? That's what you have to concentrate on. Same thing with your relationship with God. That underlies everything you do, right? So that's part of what it means for the heart to be a dwelling place for the Shekhinah. Okay? Number 2, one should avoid anger altogether, because anger leads a person to commit a variety of transgressions. Come and learn from the example of Moshe Rabbeinu, may he rest in peace. You are already aware of the injury which is incurred through anger from what our sages taught in the Zohar, alluded to in the verses, cease ye from man in whose nostrils is a breath, for how little is he to be accounted. You that tear yourself in anger. And even if another person antagonizes him, he should act as one who is insulted, yet refuses to insult others. Okay, so what's the reference to Moses, right? This is referring to the time when Moses loses his temper at the Israelites. Remember when he goes to hit the rock, they ask him for water. God says, just hold out your staff and tell the rock to bring forth water. And instead, what does Moses do? He hits the rock and he speaks very disparaging words to the Israelites. I mean, what Jewish leader hasn't lost patience with the Jews, right? So, but that's Moses, right? And what happens to Moses? Because of this, he doesn't get to go into the land of Israel. Right? the verse from Isaiah that says, "Seek ye for man in whose nostrils is a breath," right? Well, the nostrils were believed to be the part of the body most directly associated with anger, because both the word af, meaning nostril, and the term af with the same spelling, that refers to anger. So that was associated with the nostrils, right? That's the focal point of anger, and that's something that Cordovero writes about a lot in some of his other books. Right? Number 3, let an individual always enjoy the company of others and behave toward them with a kindly spirit, even with respect to people who transgress the Torah. Now, some people might think, well, that's kind of surprising. After all, Cordovero is a really, really devout Jew. And you wouldn't think that he would be willing to socialize with folks whose lifestyle wasn't like that. After all, you don't want to hang around with transgressors too much, right? But even to enjoy their company, right? Because again, these things have cosmic implications. You're trying to restore the way things should be on a very high level within the Sphirot, within the cosmos. So maybe Cordovero shouldn't do that, but that is, it is something that he says everyone has to take on. Right? You have to be willing to socialize and be kind to those who are transgressors. Right? And by the way, one of the reasons for that, you'll see later on in number 8, the verse from Genesis, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse, curse those who curse you." So, just be a blessing to other people. And don't worry about whether they are all that righteous or not. Right? So that's Cordovero's position, one that some Kabbalists and some other people in Tzfat might not have agreed with. Number 4, one should drink no wine whatsoever during the daytime, but only at night, and even then diluted. Only on Sabbaths, festivals, and the new moon may one drink during the day. Now remember that back then, life was very tough. Everybody drank, if you had the means, everybody drank a little bit of wine. Why? Because it took the edge off. Right? Now, you may think that's a good thing to do today. And if, and you may know some people who come home from work and the first thing they do is get a drink. Right? And they may or may not be alcoholics, but they do something to take the edge off. Well, that was normal back then. Well, he says, keep that in moderation, right? Only on the holy days can you drink a little bit during the day. And whenever you drink, it has to be diluted, meaning don't take too much of the edge off, right? Number 5, one should be sparing with meat and wine during the weekdays, even at night, inasmuch as these foods endow Samael, remember the evil force, right? Endow Samael with strength. Right? because, you know, if you allow yourself certain pleasures, that can have an effect also in the upper worlds, even to the extent of supporting this demon, right? And we don't want to do anything to support him. So a little bit of wine, little bit of meat, that's it. Don't enjoy yourself too much. Too much enjoyment gives power to these other forces, and we don't want that. Okay. Any comments or questions up to here?
Question.
Yes, Ann.
I understand about wine because it changes your personality or the way you behave. But what's wrong with enjoyment? What's wrong with meat?
Yeah, well, enjoyment is a little bit of a problem. You don't want to get addicted to pleasure. Okay? So keep it really, really low key as much as possible. Pleasures, even permitted pleasures, can be addictive. Right? I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if you're done. It seems to me, and correct if I'm wrong, that so the wine and the meat has two different reasons of not to enjoy yourself. I mean, not just because it causes strengthening stomach, but it looks like meat itself, it's not about enjoyment. It's just like the fat, the meat is coming from a living thing. It has a soul. It seems like it does give certain power to certain forces.
Yeah. Well, it's true that that is, accepted in Jewish thought. I don't think that's really what Cordovero is concerned with here. I think, and you'll see this along the way, he's really concerned with people being focused on their own pleasures. Don't do that, he says. Minimize your pleasures so that you don't get hooked on it. Okay. Other questions or comments here? All right, let's go back and to number 6. A person should not spend his time thinking about idle concerns during the hour of prayer, but only about Torah, the fulfillment of the commandments, and sacred matters. Now, I don't know about you guys. If I'm in Shabbat services and they last for about 2.5 hours, that's our, typical in our chapel services, right? I hate to tell you, but I don't spend all 2.5 hours focused on all the things I should. I do get distracted occasionally. And I think about things that I probably don't have anything to do with Shabbat or God or the Torah or the prayers, right? Mundane things, right? Isn't it warm in here? Or isn't it cold in here? Which of those do you experience at Beth Yeshurun, right? Right? So he says, don't do that. Yeah. He understands that people will do that, but remember that the ideal is to focus only on Torah, the fulfillment of the commandments, etc. Okay? So that is number 6. Number 7, an individual ought to refrain from speaking derogatorily about any person. This holds true even with respect to animals. Okay? Okay? Now, because if you're willing to say something bad about an animal, that's only a couple of steps away from saying something bad about another person. God forbid you should do that. Right? negative thoughts about other people, criticisms of other people. You want to stay as far away from that as possible. Right? Yes, Ann.
What was the name of that rabbi who came up with the whole book? Is it the Hafetz Chaim?
Yes.
And he said you
Hafetz
can't
Chaim,
even,
who lived at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century.
and he said you don't even roll your eyes at something that somebody said.
Yeah, don't, in any way do something that could be interpreted derogatorily towards another person. Right? So, this is, an ongoing concern in Jewish ethics, and Cordovero underscores it here. Right? Number 8, one must never curse any fellow Jew, even in a moment of anger. On the contrary, let him bless him, and by doing so, be blessed. As it is written, I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse. Right? So number 11, I skipped a few here and there. There's just so many things to include. Let an individual refrain from touching his body with his hand and from lowering his hand below his navel. Okay, so he doesn't say it directly, but we know what he's talking about, right? So, there is a tremendous discomfort with sexuality, with sexual pleasure. That's, definitely a priority for Cordovero and for most of the Kabbalists. Okay? You just, you remember we saw in Caro's list of Hanhagod, try not to take pleasure in the sexual act. Even though sometimes it is a mitzvah to perform it, try to, act as if demons were forcing you to do it. So we're not really comfortable with sexual pleasure. We know we have to do it sometimes. After all, there is this mitzvah, be fruitful and multiply. But just don't enjoy it too much. Number 14, and I want to do 14 and 15 together. Let a person commune with one of the associates every day for the purpose of conversing about devotional concerns. A person ought to discuss with the same associate every Shabbat Eve what he did each day of that past week. From there, he should go forth to welcome the Sabbath queen. In other words, you want to start with a clean slate every Shabbat. Okay? To examine carefully all of your deeds, all of your devotional life. And part of the purpose of having this community in Tzfat is that every individual should have someone. It's like, if you're in one of the 12-step groups, you have to have a sponsor. Right? You have to have somebody who's a go-to person who can evaluate, whatever actions and temptations you are facing, whatever actions you've done, how to keep you on the right track. So, presumably everybody had an associate, a sponsor, so to speak, to whom they would confess their own sins, right? May have been some of them, treated each other as their sponsors, or, that only the people at the highest levels, had someone that they could go to who maybe wasn't quite on their level. But everybody had someone that they could commune with, to confess to talk about their deeds and their motivations and everything that's going on internally for them. Right? you shouldn't just depend on your own self-evaluation. Let somebody else help you figure out what you need to be doing. Okay? Again, comments or questions up to here? Yes, Lou.
Is this last one analogous to Catholic confession to a priest?
Yes, although there's more to it than just confession of sins. It's much more extensive than that.
But we don't limit our confessions to clergy, to
Yes,
priests.
yes. That's why I compare it to the 12-step groups. Because if you're in a 12-step group, you have to have a sponsor. Sponsor's not a clergyman. He doesn't necessarily, represent your ideal. He's just there to provide an outsider's opinion about, whether you're really being honest with yourself in dealing with your deeds, your motivations, your intentions.
And he doesn't have the power or authority to absolve you of your sins.
Absolutely not. That's correct. Okay. Moving back. So here, number 16. One ought to pray the Amidah in a contemplative way to the degree that he is able. At the very least, he should concentrate meditatively during the 3 opening blessings, the 4 bows, as well as the 4 places where one stands erect again. For with respect to one who fails to concentrate upon these, the Shekhinah cries out, "The Lord has delivered me into their hands, against whom I am not to stand." All right? So in other words, you want to go beyond the letter of the law. You have, letter of the law doesn't require that you have constant kavanah, constant proper meditation and intention during all your prayers, but it's an ideal, and you want to try to live up to that ideal, right? Similarly, number 17, something that goes, again, beyond the ideal, right? Normally, talit and tefillin are only worn during the morning service. He says an individual should take care to recite mincha, the afternoon prayer, while wearing a talit and tefillin. This includes the reader's repetition of the Amidah. Okay? So, again, going beyond the letter of the law. And number 18, a man should recite the Birkat Hamazon in a loud voice so that his children may repeat it after him, letter by letter, word by word. Okay? You have to have precision in prayer, and you want to train your children to have the same precision. You're the father, that's your responsibility. So you need to train them to do it properly. And the proper recitation of every word and even every letter is very important to these mystics. In some ways, they are the inheritors of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, and those of you who were with us last year, we talked about them, the German pietists who lived in the 11th, 12th, 13th, maybe 14th century. And they really believed in the sanctity of every single word and letter in the liturgy. And there were reasons why prayers had to have the same, a certain number of words in them. And you didn't mess with that. You didn't change it. Okay? So that is also a priority. Number 19. hold on one moment. Number 19. One should be careful never to eat meat on Sunday, nor any cooked dish, nor drink wine. He ought to take greater care not to indulge in levity on this day than on other days, unless it's a Yontif, unless it's Rosh Chodesh, or a feast connected with a religious celebration. All right? So Sunday was believed to be the day of the week when the temple was destroyed. So, to treat Sunday as a day with more restrictions, a little bit less levity, that's a reflection of mourning for the destruction of the temple. Same thing with number 20. But this is every night. Every night one ought to sit on the ground, mourn the destruction of the temple, and weep on account of one's transgressions which delay the redemption. All right? So, this is a very frequent theme among the mystics of Tzfat. They followed this practice, which is called Tikkun Chatzot. Chatzot means midnight, right? They would get up at midnight and they would say prayers of mourning for the temple. And that became a regular religious practice among all the mystics of Tzfat. So you have this awareness of the temple, this constant emphasis on one's own sins, because after all, your sins delay the rebuilding of the temple. They delay the restoration of the kind of spirituality that existed, at least in their minds, in the time of the temple. Okay, so there's this constant awareness with ritual underpinnings about the destruction of the temple and its impact on the community. Number 21, a person should not prepare a secular banquet in his home, but only a feast which is connected with a religious celebration, right? These guys would never have New Year's Eve parties on December 31st. Imagine that. I mean, they're just not like that at all. Right? If you finish a tractate of Talmud and you're having a celebration for that, that's okay. That's a religious celebration. Or, a Yontif meal. That's fine. Number 25, a person should donate charity every day so as to effect atonement for his sins, as it says, and break off your sins with almsgiving, right, from the book of Daniel. All right, so be sure and give charity every single day. Now, that's a good ethical practice, I think. It would be nice if we all gave tzedakah every day. In normal times, we give tzedakah every morning at morning services. Right? So it's something we like people to do, and we encourage it. We don't force anybody to give it, but it's considered a mitzvah. Well, if you don't come to synagogue in the morning, then you probably don't see that. So here, it's just a normal part of life. You do it at home, you do it on the road, you give tzedakah every day, except, of course, for Shabbat and festivals. Okay. Number 30. Oh yeah, Anne.
If you're at home, you have a pushki.
Yes. Yes.
So you can give every day if you have coins.
Right. Well, there is a shortage of coins right now, but hopefully you have enough, to take care of that. Number 30, during the 3 weeks of mourning, all right, those are the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, right? Tisha B'Av is observed as the anniversary of the destruction of both temples. So during the 3 weeks, there are all sorts of things that, we don't have weddings during the last 9 days. It's considered appropriate not to go to live entertainment during the 3 weeks, etc. See? Going even farther than that, however, he says during the 3 weeks of mourning, an individual should avoid reciting Shehecheyanu. Right? To do something special that would require reciting that blessing, some joyous action. Nor should he eat meat or drink wine unless he is about to fast. Now, you're not supposed to drink wine or eat meat during the 9 days. But he says, even the 3 weeks, right? Unless he's about to fast. He's permitted to do so on account of his fast.
What about Shabbat? Would you eat meat on Shabbat?
Yes. Actually, during the 9 days, even, you're supposed to eat meat and drink wine on Shabbat. So it only applies to the other days. So, if you go around to kosher restaurants and you look, you will see that many of them have a special menu for the 9 days. Right? If you go to Genesis website, you'll see that, for instance, because they have a clientele who keep these laws, right? So, we keep the 9 days. It's, it's just part of the program. But here it says, we expand on the program. We keep it all the way through the 3 weeks. Now, some of these things are rooted in teachings in the Talmud. So, for instance, this business of, not having a secular banquet in your home, the Talmud says every feast that is not held on account of a mitzvah, a scholar should not derive enjoyment from it, right? Whoever partakes of a secular feast eventually goes into exile. Wow, that's harsh. Just don't go to those New Year's Eve parties, right? The regular giving of tzedakah, right? And, that's a pretty constant theme in Jewish practice, right? Number 31. Yes, please.
This is Jerry.
Yes, Jerry.
When I was growing up, my father had a minhag. He says, we do not celebrate birthdays. He says, we only celebrate yurtzites.
Yes.
And he said there's verses in the Torah that justify that. So he said, where in the Torah does it talk about birthdays? There's only one place. Moses went down to the river and Pharaoh was taking a bath, right? Because it was his birthday, correct?
There's a midrash to that effect.
Yeah. But we follow that very strictly. And he says the reason was because Pharaoh was taking a bath, but he was also telling the people he was a god. And what he was really doing was going to the bathroom.
Yes. So that is in the midrash. And so the sages kind of developed that into the idea that you shouldn't celebrate birthdays. It's a pagan thing. Nowadays, most people really don't think of it that way. I celebrate my birthday, but here in Tzfat, that would be considered a secular banquet, a secular celebration. So he would say, don't celebrate birthdays. Right.
But,
And so, that may have been something that was passed down in your family,
right.
right? Yes,
And-
Ann.
I'm confused because it used to be, I heard that Jews don't do birthdays, but in the past 20 or 30 years, I've been hearing we celebrate the Hebrew birthday of the Hebrew calendar by blessing other people.
Yeah, interesting. That custom has developed, but it's relatively recent. The other, while not universally observed, was a time-honored practice not everyone observed it, but certainly many of the scholars observed it, that you just didn't celebrate birthdays. Whether it was on the Hebrew day in the calendar that your birthday fell or otherwise. Right? Other comments or questions before we go on? Okay. Number 31, a person should fast in accordance with his capacity. Okay? Well, in the tradition, there really isn't a push to get people to fast. Just, there are certain occasions when you fast, but not that you should feel obliged to do it more than that. Here, it's like fasting for the sake of fasting. Fasting for the sake of breaking your desire for food. And the Kabbalists said, well, that's a good thing. Number 32, a person ought to meditate upon matters of Torah with each and every bite he eats, in order that his food may serve as a sacrifice and his drinking of water and wine as drink offerings. So this is, again, a concession to the fact that, yes, you need to eat and drink, but we want to make sure that you do it in a very holy way. So whenever you eat and drink, make sure that you meditate on Torah every bite. Okay? So that's, try that sometime, right? Yeah, that would be a big adjustment for me. All right. Number 35, one should weep during each of the prayer services, or at least during one of them. Okay. So this is, a regular mystical practice. We don't think of it much now because we weren't taught to do it, but you would weep in order to, let's say, change your state into one that is more receptive to God. Weep because you're not feeling so close, and hopefully that will help you feel closer to God. Okay? Now, we all know that if you have a good cry, you feel differently afterwards. It changes your state. Well, Jewish mystics and other mystics, by the way, the Sufi mystics did this too. They utilized weeping as a means of enhancing their spirituality. Okay? A person ought to fast for 3 consecutive days, 4 times each year, during each of the 4 seasons. Praiseworthy is the individual who adds to this. All right. Now, a fast for 3 consecutive days presumably is, just a fast from sun up to sundown. right? That's considered a normal fast, not, a 24, 25-hour fast like Yom Kippur is. But he says you should do it 4 times a year, 3 days in a row. And if you can add to that, all the better. Right? So again, it's a way of cutting into your desires. Right? Again, now, by the way, the one thing I didn't mention about number 32, right? This is a theme that became very important later on in Hasidism, which is the idea of dedicating the physical to the spiritual. Right? They called it avodah b'gashmiut, service through doing physical things. So when we get to Hasidism, and that may not be till next year, we'll see how that plays out there. Right? But in Tzfat, the big emphasis is minimizing enjoyment of food. Okay? Let's say number 37, a person ought to converse in Hebrew with the associates at all times, right? Hebrew is a holy language. So let's, rather than keeping it just for prayer and study, let's use it all the time. Of course, you have to adjust your actions accordingly. You have to act in a holy way all the time, right? Number 38, every time you bench, you should study Mishnah and read one Psalm before that, right? Again, it's more than you would normally have to do. 39, a person should study Mishnah every Erev Shabbat in accordance with his capacity. In other words, if you're not so learned, maybe you learn one Mishnah. Study that one Mishnah, right? That's your capacity. If you're a sage, so you study a tractate every Erev Shabbat. Number 40, every week, a person should review all the Mishnah that he knows. Remember that Caro had talked about putting special importance on the Mishnah, because it's associated with the Shekhinah, right? So here, the idea is we want to have as much Mishnah in our hands as in our minds as possible. And that would also bridge into regular mystical practices. Yeah, Ann, did you have a question?
We're
Comment?
supposed to be able to read Mishnah, and I can't imagine being able to do that at all.
To
Even
read
one
it?
line.
I'm not sure I understand.
I don't know any Mishnah at all. I don't.
well,
and if I
well,
took
you
up
know,
a
if
book
you
of
were living
Mishnah,
in
I would
Tzfat-
be totally unable to understand even one line.
Yeah, so you know what?
And I bet there's a lot of people like that.
Probably not true for you, Ann, but yeah, I'm sure that's true of a lot of people. In Tzfat, if you were part of this circle, it was assumed that you would know at least some Mishnah.
So this is only for people in Tzfat?
These are Cordevero's rules for people who are part of his circle of students and mystical practitioners. So yeah, if you're going to be part of this circle, you need to get with the program. And Mishnah is an important part of the program. Mishnah is associated with Shekhinah, and don't you want to have a closer relationship with Shekhinah? If you're part of the circle, you definitely do. So you got to be with the program. And number 40, and the number 41, an individual should learn at least 2 chapters of Mishnah by heart every week. Okay? That's That's it. You know, you have to learn it. You're part of the circle. You're going to learn Mishnah because you want to be closer to Shekhinah. And that's one way to do it. Okay, questions or comments up to here? So overall reactions to this list of Cordovero. Yes, Rose. Rose, I can't hear you.
Were there any women in his group? Because in some of these, it says particularly male, and others it said everyone should do this.
Yeah, no, when he's talking about everyone, he's pretty much talking about men. Women were just not part of the Kabbalistic program.
So
And
he's ta-
now it may have been that some of the more learned women, those who knew how to read, those who had picked up a little bit, maybe from hearing their fathers teach, that they understood some of the basics. And, you know, particularly with regard to sexuality, their intentions may have been aligned with those of their husbands. But that was probably not common.
And these scholars are people who probably did not have any daytime job, that they spent all of their
It
time.
varied. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Some of them, their wives had a job and they supported them, and, you know, so that they could just sit and study and, you know, have mystical contemplation the whole day. It varied.
Thank you.
Are there still those in Tzfat today who follow Cordovero's guidelines, precepts?
Well, probably not specifically Cordovero. There are some Kabbalists in Tzfat, but they really had to rebuild the community over time, because in the 17th century, there was an earthquake in Tzfat, which basically destroyed the whole town, almost everything. Not everything. There are a couple of synagogues you can go to which are well preserved, or at least they've been, whatever damage there was from the earthquake, they've repaired it. So when you go to Israel, and you definitely should go to Tzfat,
Yeah.
you can see some of those synagogues. But the community, whatever Kabbalistic community came about after that had to be reestablished. Tzfat was a flourishing economic community. There were plenty of jobs there. It was a big textile industry. So many of the scholars were very wealthy. They didn't have to have their wives support them. They were independently wealthy. Or they had people who managed the business for them and just, took whatever minimal income they needed. Cordovero, I think, was independently wealthy because he just wrote and wrote and wrote. In addition to his classes, which were many, he's just incredibly prolific. Yes, Francois.
When he says about to fast as much as you can, okay. So what Cordovero, what was his routine as far as fasting? Like any information we have in this regard?
From the time that he got up, probably before sunrise, until after he prayed the evening service after sunset, it was no food and no water. It's full fast for that part of the day, not the night. And then he, probably didn't have a big feast like, Ramadan is, you have a big meal at the end of the day after sunset. But their practice would be, yeah, we fast, but we break the fast with a modest meal.
So from my understanding, when someone say fasting, it's like from Eve to the next, from Mariv to Mariv.
Right.
So my,
But in Judaism, that was only true on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av.
oh, okay.
Even today, for the minor fasts, like, Tanit Esther and the 10th of Tevet and so forth, Shivas or B'Tammuz, all those days, it's just sun up to sunset. Okay. Other questions or comments? Yes, Jerry. You have to unmute yourself, Jerry.
You hear me?
Yes.
Would you discuss this concept of only talking to Hebrew to everybody in your circle? Because I've never seen that before. I know when I was growing up, they would only talk Yiddish to each other.
Yes. Now, this was particular to the community of the Kabbalists. It did not necessarily filter into the rest of the community, even, the Orthodox rest of the community. They didn't feel that Hebrew was, speaking Hebrew was a mitzvah. And in fact, many people reserved Hebrew only for the prayers and for Torah study.
But in Israel
For the
now,
Kabbalists, it was another matter entirely. Yes, Ann?
in Israel now, it's not, people are not doing a
Well, of course,
mitzvah, they're
it's the
just
spoken
talking.
language from, again, most people in Israel, they, speak Hebrew regularly. Although, again, there are a few who only use Hebrew for prayer and Torah study.
now, it's good to mention that the Ari, he actually decided to speak only Hebrew as well. So it must be has like certain, of course, power to achieve more closeness to their goal.
To achieve what?
More closeness, closer to their
Yes.
goal.
Closeness. Okay, thank you.
You
So, yeah, I mean, Hebrew, presumably, at least this is the position of the traditional world at that time, Kabbalists or not, their position was Hebrew is the language God spoke. After all, God didn't say, let there be light. God said, Yahi or, because that's what the Torah says. So the Torah is in Hebrew, and Hebrew is God's language, and therefore speaking Hebrew brings you closer to God.
makes
Right?
perfect sense.
Yeah, right. It seems logical. Now you do have to accept that premise, right? That God actually spoke words in the creation, and that the words he spoke were in the Hebrew language. Right? If you accept that premise, I'll go all the way to the bank with that. Yes, Ann.
Well, there's a pun in Hebrew that hardly works in any other language, although it does work in English. She shall be called Isha, for out of Ish she was taken. Most languages, German, for example, it's Mann and Frau, and the whole sentence in the German translation makes no sense.
Right, in
And-
English also.
But in English it does. Woman
Well,
out of man. So it works in
yeah.
English, but most languages doesn't, and that proves
It's
that he must have been
expanded.
speaking Hebrew.
It's expanded in both languages. That's true. So, yeah, there are things you can do in Hebrew that fit very nicely with Jewish teachings. But really, the reason why Hebrew is a holy language for them is that it's the language God spoke. Other questions or comments? boy, I had wanted to get this last text in, but we are out of time. So
Oh, come on.
I know. We'll just have to finish it up next week, and then we'll go on to the next unit. Thank you all very much. Happy Hanukkah, everyone, and see you next week.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you,
Happy
Rabbi.